There's a lot of folks out there who think that faith and reason, science and religious faith are somehow diametrically opposed, but is that true? I'll be right back. Well, hey there, Gracious Gang. It's Mike from thegraciousguest.org here with you for another episode of The Gracious Guest Show on the Gracious Guest YouTube channel or the podcast. If you're listening to us that way, happy to have you here. People listen to this in a couple different ways and in different times of their day. If you're on a drive, hopefully, just to be clear, if you're on a drive, you're listening to the podcast version, not watching the YouTube version. Let's just be careful. But whatever is your situation, however you came here, you're welcome. I'm so happy that you've joined us today. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that already. We take up a lot of different topics here, literature, travel, more directly kind of faith-related topics, but also a recurring topic that comes up is the one we're going to explore today in perhaps the most depth we ever have here. So I'm thrilled to journey into this interview that I'm going to share with you here in a second, related to the harmony, really, of reason and faith, the harmony of religion and science, and trying to unpack a little bit of maybe the history of where this notion that's so popular out there, and very thick in the ground in a lot of places that I tend to travel. This notion is that there's somehow a obvious, for sure, 100% factual disjunct between those who have a more religious or traditional religious mentality, any notion of a creator, any notion of the transcendent, the divine, versus those who are far more supposedly intellectually astute, those who are in on the truth here, that's just basically fairy tales, that's mythology, that's primitive notion of trying to explain phenomena we see around us. So as I had a friend in high school who said, when we were talking about this 20 years ago plus, he said, and he was sincere. He said, I just really believe that, people in the old times, they would see a cloud and they would go, oh, that's God making that. And in his mind, the fact that we now had a better scientific understanding of the meteorological conditions that make for the production of clouds, that somehow proves God doesn't exist. And even then, I tried to walk through that with him, and I was far less able to do so, and my vocabulary wasn't that good myself. My faith was not as strong as it is now, nor was my rational capability. So I'd like to think that as I myself have grown in my life, those questions have continued to be near and dear to my heart, and I've done a lot of thinking about them and continue to, and I consider myself a man of faith and reason. I've seen in my own life from experience how they work together, and I have a couple of quotes I want to share here along the way, just some things to consider. But before I do that, I want to get to the interview. So I'll close with some of that stuff at the end. I don't want to delay you anymore here. I want to get to the main event. Dr. Stephen M. Barr is the president of the Society of Catholic Scientists. He was a professor emeritus in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Delaware and the former director of its Bartle Research Institute. He had got his PhD in physics in 1978 from Princeton University. Professor Barr does research in theoretical particle physics, especially grand unified theories, theories of CP violation, neutrino oscillations, and particle cosmology. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society and the author of Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, published by the University of Notre Dame Press. There is a lot of information out there. If you look up Catholic scientists, you're going to see Dr. Barr at the top of the list, and wonderful, delightful man to speak to. I interviewed him a few years ago in a different sort of a venue for a different program, and I'm really delighted to have him for the first time here on the Gracious Guest Show. So let's get right to my interview with Dr. Stephen M. Barr. Check it out. Okay, Dr. Steve Barr, thanks so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Well, and I mentioned to you before we started here that anything kind of broadly speaking that seems to touch on this intersection of faith and science, or as I'm titling, I think, this episode, the harmony of reason and faith, something along those lines. It really tends to pique a lot of interest. I've seen it in the classroom with my high school students. in youth group settings, so I thought we'd start off, a little time we have here today, maybe just getting a little bit about your own background for our audience here, kind of where you're coming from, and then we'll get into some questions here I have for you and your
Okay.
perspective.
So religiously, my background is Catholic. I was raised Catholic, and my mother was Catholic. My father was actually of Jewish background, though not religious, although he became a Catholic when he was 78. So,
Oh,
I'm a cradle Catholic. My scientifically, I've been, in a sense, a scientist all my life. I always knew I was going to go into science, probably something very mathematical, and that's what I did. So I got my undergraduate degree in physics at Columbia University, and then I went to grad school and got my PhD in theoretical physics. That was in 1978, and then I've done research, primarily research for 40 something years after that. About 40 years after that, was a prof- and for the last 30 something years, I was a professor at the University of Delaware in theoretical physics. I actually formally retired in 2020 to devote full time to running the Society of Catholic Scientists, which we
hmm.
can talk about more later. But
Yeah,
that's an international organization of Catholic scientists that was founded in 2016 by myself and a few other uh, scientists. We've now grown be reasonably large, and that's why I've had to, so I retired in order to devote full time to being president of the
sure.
Society of Catholic Scientists.
Sure. Well, and that's, I think when I was thinking of catching up with you again, because as folks may or may not know that I have a much bigger audience now than I used to, quite frankly, and
Right,
coming from different sources here. But I hosted for many years a youth and young adult radio program for Holy Family Radio in the Harrisburg area, and
right,
we had connected back then to talk about this theme, and I wanted to sort of catch up, sort of with you
right,
on it, and the way I had phrased the question to you in the email had just been basically looking at, as I said, the current cultural academic landscape, and things just even in the last, 5 years or so since we spoke, 4 or 5 years. I run into this a lot. I'm sure you run into it a lot more. I just wanted to see if you could kind of give us your take on, as you see it, where do things stand right now in this cultural and kind of academic imagination of how faith and science can or cannot work together? What's the kind of perception out there that you've encountered?
Well, I don't necessarily interact with a cross section of the whole population.
Right.
Um, I do know that there have been studies recently by well-known groups like the Pew Foundation, I think it's called, and others that have shown that a lot of young people nowadays believe that there's a conflict between science and faith. And in fact, that is one of the main reasons, and perhaps the main reason given by young people who leave the faith for why they
Mm,
do so. I'm not just talking about Catholics, but religious people generally. One of the main reasons that young people abandon their religious faith is a perception on their part that there's some kind of conflict between science and faith. So it's a very big issue. Now, it's not. This is not a recent thing. People
mm,
have been claiming that there's a conflict for a long time. I mean, this probably goes back at least 200 years, but I think it's intensified in the last couple of decades uh,
mm.
for various reasons. And I'm not a sociologist, so I can't necessarily explain why it's intensified, but it has become, at least in this country, it's become more of an issue recently.
Mm. And, and is that something that you saw? I mean, so and have you experienced that? I would imagine potentially in the classroom, even, or just in your own
No,
interactions, or I
not
guess, well,
really.
maybe not in terms of whatever
Well, I mean,
you're not necessarily focusing on that, I guess, probably, but
well, what? Not really. I mean, so my teaching was largely at the graduate level, and
okay,
and I teach physics. So, our classroom discussions are on highly technical physics questions. We
right.
don't talk about, bigger issues. philosophy or religion.
Hmm.
So I can't really give you any classroom experience. Maybe behind your question is, did I experience any of this in my career as a scientist? Did I? And the
Sure.
answer is not really. I mean, there is this idea out there that the scientific world is a wasteland as far as religion goes, and that the scientific world is populated by people who are sort of fire-breathing atheists, and if you go into science and you're a religious person, you're going to be facing hostility and discrimination and persecution and so on. And that's simply not generally the case. I mean, I've been, I got my PhD quite a long time ago, as I said, about that's 45 years almost now, and I can only think in all that time of two episodes where somebody actually treated me with a little bit of hostility because I was
Mm.
religious. I mean, you don't encounter that. There's actually quite a lot of scientists who are religious. I wouldn't say majority by any means, but there's certainly quite a large number, and so the scientific world is not this atheist um,
Right.
wasteland that people imagine. It's
Hmm.
there's a lot. I encounter far more people who are themselves religious than I do people who are sort of militantly anti-religious,
Mm.
frankly.
Well, and this might be a good place to ask you this because I think it's kind of related. I wonder sometimes if some of the more militant kind of folks or people that maybe present themselves that way at least or kind of
Mm-hmm.
address the
They
the
are
issue
they're
in
they're
that sort of
out
militant
there.
way.
This yeah.
Well, and that's I wonder if sometimes they don't in some cases do a whole lot of good for the scientific side of it either because they may not be very good representatives so to speak of the scientific community and specifically what I'm thinking of here is I occasionally will run into occasionally in YouTube comments. Most of the time they're fine, but occasionally YouTube comments specifically that lean on quote science. A lot of times I come away from it scratching my head with what that particular person was even trying to get at. They seemed to throw a
Yeah.
vague reference out there to science, but it just seemed
Yeah,
to
I
be a
mean,
perception more than anything,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. So when you ask, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who go around claiming to speak in the name of science or say that what they say is somehow supported by science. But when you dig a little deeper, you find out there's often not much to that.
Hmm.
Um, but I will say this, and this is one of the reasons that we founded the Society of Catholic Scientists back in 2016. What you face, I think, a lot of religion. The problem, I think, is this: religious people have been too reticent, too quiet about sharing their faith or being open about their faith. Uh, Atheists have tend to be, though among atheists there are more vocal people. Not all
Hmm.
atheists are vocal about it, but let's put it this way: among the people who are vocal on the question, they tend to be overwhelmingly atheists up until
Right.
recently, and they've basically dominated the public conversation. And so you've had very well-known scientists, Stephen Hawking, for example, or Stephen Weinberg in my field, so who are or Neil deGrasse Tyson. I
Hmm.
shouldn't really put him in the same breath with those other two I mentioned because he's really more a popularizer of science
Hmm.
than where the other two are really great scientists.
Right.
But they're all over the place expressing their views on religion. Religious people tend to be sort of quiet about it. And I think that therefore people that's what's contributed to the idea that all scientists are atheists is that it's only the atheists that we've heard from.
Right.
And I think that's the problem. That's the
Sure.
problem. And I one of the things that's led to is a kind of vicious circle where uh, because religious people are quiet about their faith, they don't know about each other's existence.
Hmm.
So you could have a professor of physics in a university who is religious, and he may be several other religious people in the same department. they don't know that about each other's faith.
Right.
And
Huh.
so, and the students don't necessarily know about it. And so people, so religious people in science can feel isolated because they don't know about each other's existence. When I was a grad student, for example, or an undergrad, I could not have told you any professor in my department, in my physics department, who I knew to be religious,
Hmm.
except for one, and he was Orthodox Jew and he wore a yarmulke, so you could tell. But I didn't know, and I couldn't have named any world famous scientist at that time who was alive at that time who I knew to be religious or Catholic. And so you begin to feel isolated.
Hmm.
And that's our fault
Yeah.
because we've kept our mouths shut for too long. So one of the reasons we started the society is so that Catholic scientists in particular would know of each other's existence, and we'd sort of realize how numerous we are, and we are quite
Right.
numerous.
Yeah.
And that would encourage, first of all, that would make people a little bit less fearful about being open about their faith if they realized actually that there's a lot of their colleagues who are religious, and in particular, a lot of them who are practicing and believing Catholics.
Sure.
And so that's one of our goals is kind of break this out of this sort of vicious cycle we're in.
Right.
But yeah, so I think that's the problem, and I think that's the reason we've allowed these false perceptions to grow that there is a conflict between science and faith because we haven't also told our side of the story.
Hmm.
We
Right.
There's a lot of facts and arguments. There are a lot. There's a lot of historical facts. There are a lot of scientific facts. There's a lot of arguments in favor. There are a lot of things that we know as from science that, if anything, support uh, religious belief.
Right.
We have a lot of facts and arguments on our side in the
Hmm.
discussion of faith and science. But we haven't presented these to people. People don't
Right.
know about these facts and arguments, and again, that's on us, and that's
Right.
what we're trying to change.
Well, and that wasn't, I mean, my own kind of academic, progression wasn't in the sciences per se, but I always had a great interest and love, sometimes frustration that it didn't click
Mm.
with me quite as much. But I always maintain an interest, especially in anything to do with what I used to call space, but I'm increasingly calling the heavens. Um,
Well,
but
not to be
that's just my
confused with heaven in the religious sense of
exactly
heaven.
right. But no,
So in a way, that's a
that
trick.
exactly but that kind of cosmological stuff was just always fascinating to me, and I anything that would deal with anything in that category, if you want to call it that.
Right.
But for me, I mean, I never really remember hearing, just like you're saying, I didn't know that Father Lemaitre had, or I never knew he existed, let alone had to
That's a
anything to do
beautiful
with,
example.
right, and Gregor Mendel, and you
Right.
start learning about the all the craters named for Jesuit scientists, because
Exactly.
so these
This
these
is a
kinds of
perfect
things.
illustration of what I was saying. Yeah, this is a
Right.
perfect illustration.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, I mean, I do part of what I did. I'm more retired from research now, but what I did as a theoretical particle physicist, we also do a lot of cosmology
Hmm.
of the early universe. Those two fields are very closely related.
Sure.
So I've written a lot of papers on cosmology, on the early universe, and I only learned in relatively recent times that the Big Bang Theory was proposed by Georges Lemaitre, who's a Catholic priest and a
Hmm.
theoretical physicist. Um, I myself, having done research in that field, was not aware of this until maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Wow.
It's not emphasized, it wasn't until recently emphasized in one's scientific education.
Hmm.
Okay. And, when I would go out and give talks in the past to Catholic audiences, sometimes they'd be students, sometimes they'd be professors, whatever, the general public. I would ask them what one name historically comes to mind when you think of the relation between the Catholic Church and science. And everyone would immediately say, Galileo. The
Galileo.
audience would
I
respond in
assumed.
Galileo. And then, but
Yeah.
I show them pictures. Nowadays, I begin all my talk, many of my talks, by opening slide. I show a picture of Georges Lemaitre standing with Einstein,
Hmm.
a famous picture of them standing together. And I say, who is that person standing with Einstein? And only a few hands will go up. This was a Catholic priest who proposed the
Yeah.
Big Bang Theory. A
Yeah.
major figure in 20th century physics was a Catholic priest, and Catholics don't know this.
Right.
And this is an illustration of how we have not told our story.
Hmm.
If people knew all the fact, if people were better informed about the history of science and about what science has really discovered about the world, and they were more informed
Right.
about certain theological ideas,
Sure.
they would not fall for this narrative, this false narrative that science and religion are opposed to each other.
Hmm.
It's not just that you can pick out isolated examples. I mean,
Right.
of a famous scientist who was a priest, and there are quite a number of great scientists who were priests. You mentioned Gregor Mendel, but I could list several other famous ones, founders of whole branches of science who were Catholic priests. But what people don't realize is that modern people's impression, because of the Galileo episode, their impression is that for the ever since modern science arose in the scientific revolution of the 17th century, 400 years ago, that science and religion have been at loggerheads, and that the religious people were sort of revolutionaries who were sort of overthrowing a religious view of the world.
Hmm.
And that's not true at all. From the time of Galileo and Kepler in the early 1600s, all the way at least into the late 1800s, I would say until the middle or late 1800s, most scientists in that period were devoutly religious,
Right.
Catholics and Protestants, including Galileo and Kepler and
Hmm.
Newton and Boyle and all the great founders of science. They were all devout, almost all of them were devoutly religious. So they were not, the
Right.
science and religion weren't fighting with each other because the scientists were religious.
Mm-mm.
And people don't know that. They see, they have a completely distorted view
Right.
of the history of science. And I think that's one of the really big, aside from science itself, just
Right.
the people's view of the history of science is completely out of whack. And I think that's
Yeah.
contributed to this.
Well, it seems like a baseline assumption, even among sometimes, kind of Sunday mass going Catholics who just don't
Yeah.
maybe know any better. There seems almost like there's this fear at the heart of it that, like, really deep
Oh,
down,
yes.
there could be some scientific discovery made that disproves and unravels the whole thing, and the church is afraid
Mm-hmm.
of that. And there's just so much wrong, right, with
Right.
that assumption that I think I don't even know where to begin
Yes, there's a
sometimes
lot
with
of,
that. So,
exactly. There's a lot of fear. There are many, this is a big topic. We can go on for hours about this, but
right.
there are many things that contribute to this. That because people have this view of science, which is also a little bit overdrawn, well, actually quite a lot overdrawn. That every great revolution in science, from Copernicus to Newton to Darwin to theory of relativity to quantum mechanics, there are all these revolutions in science that completely overturn our view of everything, and things that we used to think were obvious or common sense are now shown to be naive and simple-minded. And there's some truth to that. I mean, so it seems obvious, our notions that two events can be simultaneous with each other in some
Mm,
absolute sense. That seems obvious, and yet it turns out to be untrue. Or no, so yes, and quantum mechanics has shown that certain of our common sense views are actually not quite right. And so that's, I think, contributed to the fear that along is, the next scientific revolution is going to, just completely blow away everything that we've sort of cherished and held dear, and our whole view of life, including our religious notions. And again, I think this is overdrawn. I mean, it gets really absurd at some points. I remember
mm.
seeing a headline a few years ago in newspapers saying physics experiment on quantum physics experiment has shown that there is no objective reality. That's preposterous. And I
Yeah.
say this as somebody who has worked in a branch of physics where quantum mechanics is my daily work. I mean, that my field is a quantum mechanical field, so I know quantum mechanics quite well.
Mhm.
And it's a nonsensical statement. You see, but people are primed to believe that.
Right.
Oh my God, the scientists have shown that there's no objective reality. Well,
Right.
that's crazy talk. And yet people are ready to believe that. And you see that also with this preposterous, when the term God particle arose.
Yeah.
This one is really funny because physicists don't call the Higgs boson a God particle. They
Right.
laugh. If you're in a room full of people in my field, we're the people that study Higgs bosons and
Right.
so on. If you're in a field of actual theoretical particle physicists and you said the God particle, immediately there'd be a lot of snickering and
Hmm.
laughing at that because it's so silly. That was a journalist's term,
Right.
not a scientist term.
Yeah.
But people hear that and they say, oh my God, has science now discovered some particle that takes the place of God?
Mm.
Does the God particle somehow, and they even, there are many articles in newspapers that somehow say that the Higgs boson has something to do with how the universe began. So
Yeah.
maybe the God particle has created the universe and we don't need, this is nonsense, utter nonsense. The Higgs boson is just a particle. It's like an electron or a
Mm.
neutron or a proton. It's simply a particle. It has nothing to do with how the universe was
Right.
began. It has nothing to do with theology or
It
religion.
doesn't explain itself.
It doesn't. It's yeah. And so the idea that the
Yeah.
God particle is a threat to religion is preposterous. It's like saying that electricity is a threat to religion or
Mm.
something. I mean, it's silly. But again, as you said, people
Right.
have been almost trained to expect these revolutions in science that are going to destroy their whole view of the world. And
Right.
I think that people have to stop being so, I don't know, fragile and
Afraid.
easily
Right. Well, that's
shocked.
well, and it's I had this quote here. I was just reading recently. Stratford Caldecott of happy memory had this book.
Yes.
Was a beauty for truth's sake on the reenchantment of education. And I think, and he quoted you in there, and and I was reading the other day, and I chuckled because I knew we were going to chat here. But he had this beautiful quote early on where he just said, and this is worth you can meditate forever on this. But he says, "The truth that reason seeks is not within its own reach." The truth that reasons, and I thought about that, and I thought that is such a beautiful meditation point. The idea that it's not, the way I see it, I've come to see it as there's no diametrically opposed in actuality diametrically opposed situation here where it's well, I can either be religious or a person of faith, therefore I check my brain at the door,
No.
or I'm a
Right.
very rational scientific person who doesn't have time for those fairy tales. It's I just think that's just an unfair way of
Right. Now
painting the whole picture.
that quote from Caldecott, that is not me, the quote. That's from Caldecott. Now I think what
Or
he's
his
saying
right.
there is that our minds are finite. We can know that our the church teaches that we can know the truth through reason and observation. The truth, the Catholic Church has always
Hmm.
respected the power of human reason and the truths that reason that we can learn through applying our reason. Um, but our reason is finite, and there are things that do exceed it. They don't contradict it,
Right.
but they exceed it. And God is one of those because our minds are finite. Our human minds are finite, but God is infinite. And so a human mind cannot grasp the divine essence, cannot grasp the divine nature. Not, and so there are truths, especially truths about God or truths about God's relation to the world. There are many truths that exceed our power to fully grasp them. Doesn't mean we can't grasp them in part.
Hmm.
Even the mysteries of faith. The mysteries of faith aren't things that are irrational. They're not things that
Right.
are contrary to reason. The analogy I use in one of my books is what we say is not that the truths of faith or the dogmas of our faith are like a wall
Hmm.
blocking our vision, and that on the and no, what we're saying is that the truth has endless vistas, as it were,
Sure.
and therefore there's a limit to what we can see, not because we're not allowed to think past a certain point,
Hmm.
but they're truths we won't grasp fully, just as there are things that are so far away that we won't be able to see them. That is, the vistas are the horizon, as it were, is so far away.
Right.
And so the mysteries of faith are simply reflect the infinity of truth. That there is, even Isaac Newton, used that famous image that he felt that he, who had discovered so much, was like a child on the seashore, pouring water out of a seashell,
Right.
and that what he was able to grasp was like the water in the seashell compared to the whole ocean of truth.
Yeah.
And so that's what we believe as Christians, is that the mysteries of faith are simply reflecting the vastness of what there is to know and understand, which only God's infinite mind can fully grasp. We can constantly advance in knowledge, but we'll always, because of our finitude, there'll always be things that exceed our grasp.
Sure. Which really seems to be like this very clear built-in, once again, a reminder of the importance of humility. I would
Yes,
say too, right? That we're encouraged to go and employ the scientific method and employ this reason, this rational capability that God has given to us as much as we can,
as
to the
much as we
fullest
can.
fullest extent with no
Yeah,
restrictions.
Saint
Right.
Augustine said about the mysteries of faith, about faith. He said, I believe in order that I may understand. What we know
Mm,
by faith, we're supposed to try to understand it better. It's a
mm,
spur, like just as in science and physics. Every time we discover a new thing, with telescopes or with
right.
particle accelerator, we discover it's something more for us to think about and to try to understand. The more we learn, the more there is for us to try to understand. And so, what
Right.
we know by faith, what has been revealed by God, and that's what our faith is based on, truths that God has revealed to us, are things that we want to understand. It's not that we, as you say, we check our brains at the door. We want to understand the truths of faith as well as we can, and so it's actually uh, far from being a disincentive for thinking. We have more to think about because
Right.
we
Right.
have access to certain very interesting
Yeah.
truths
That
that
was
we wouldn't
another
have otherwise.
that was another fascinating point in that same book I was mentioning earlier, as he nears the end of his argument. And that book is really focused especially on the quadrivium, within the classical
Mm-hmm.
tradition, and recovering a proper sense of how that interplay with geometry, arithmetic, music and astronomy should all fit together. And he made a really, I think, interesting argument for the modern imagination, while it's claiming that the religious mentality is actually limited and narrow-minded, that he was making a good argument that it's in many ways the other way around, that there's this, in a materialist kind of notion, it kind of flattens out the whole universe to this
Correct.
just two-dimensional, and yeah, sure, well, maybe it's infinite, but it's infinitely flat, whereas the religious, if you want to call it that, mentality that's open to the more vertical, that
Well,
you're intersecting with both the horizontal and that vertical, and it's a far more intriguing and truer approach to reality.
right. I mean, it's not that we don't ask questions and that the atheists do, which is what atheists like to
Right.
tell themselves. It's actually, I think in certain ways, it's quite the opposite. So let me give you a couple of examples. Um, so atheists say, scientific atheists, people who are
Mhm.
scientific atheists will say, or materialists, as you say, um, they'll say we don't need religion to explain anything because we can explain everything through science. Now, explaining things in science ultimately means explaining them in terms of the physical sciences, the physics, chemistry,
Sure.
and so on. And physicists like to think that physics is the most fundamental branch of natural science because ultimately everything is in the natural world, all natural processes flow from the laws of physics.
Mhm.
And so they'll say we can explain everything scientifically. What that means to a scientist is ultimately you can explain them using the laws of physics. Okay. All When you explain any natural process, you're ultimately explaining it in terms by saying that the process happens the way it does because of the laws of physics.
Mhm.
But then that raises a question. Why are there laws of physics?
which is a good
Okay?
question.
Why are
That's a
there? Now,
good
this is a
question.
question that I do not think most atheists stop to ask themselves.
Okay.
Because they say, well, laws of physics explain everything. But why are there laws of physics? Now, physics does not explain why there are laws of physics.
Hmm.
No physicist, I think, worth his salt would say that physics explains why there are laws of physics. Physics assumes that there are laws of physics and tries to find out what those laws are,
Hmm.
but doesn't explain why there are laws of physics. Now, there are only two answers to that. One is that there's a law that anyone has ever proposed.
Sure.
If any of your listeners knows of a third, I'd like to know it because I've never heard it from a philosopher or a physicist or anybody else. You either say that there's a lawgiver, and that's God, presumably.
Hmm.
I mean, that's, uh, or you
Right.
say there just are, and there's no answer to why there is. It's a brute fact. There just are these laws. That's your choice, which means
Hmm.
you're sort of given up on answering the question. You
Sure.
either say there's no answer, so we should stop asking. It's a pointless question which can't be answered, has no answer. Or you say there is an answer, which is there's a lawgiver, and that leads you in the direction of God.
Hmm.
So there's a place where we ask the question, and the atheist not only doesn't ask himself the question, or if he does, dismisses the question as a waste of time. Another one is why is there a world at all? Why does anything exist?
Hmm.
Um, the famous philosopher Leibniz asked it in the form, why is there something rather than nothing?
Right.
Now, there are really only two answers to that. Again, though there's a third has been proposed, but it's a nonsensical answer, as we'll see. One is there's a cause of being. There's some, there's some, there is something which is the cause of being, the source of being. And that is a traditional way of understanding who God is. He is
Right.
the giver of being. And he does not need an explanation for why he exists because he exists of necessity.
Hmm.
That's the traditional understanding. God is a necessary being. He must exist. That it is his nature to exist. That's
Hmm.
why he says to Moses, I am who am.
Right. He's
Existence
not.
is
He's
his
not
very
contingent.
existence. Yeah,
Right.
his existence. That is what he is. He is the being, the necessary being who exists by his very nature.
Right.
And he causes the being of everything else. Or you say there's no explanation for why there's anything. I mean, why does this exist rather than not exist? It just does. Why is there a world? It just is there, period.
Hmm.
It's a brute fact. So again, we think that's an interesting question and we have an answer. You may not like the answer, but the answer is there's a source of being, and that's what we call God. Or you say there's no answer. So who is it that is dismissing questions without trying to
Right.
answer them? Not us. And so I think the idea that religious people are the ones who don't ask questions and the atheists are the ones who do is actually backwards. But I gave as an example the question of why does anything exist? Why does there a universe at all?
Sure.
And it's not long before he died, the great physicist Stephen Hawking, who was an atheist, was claiming rather foolishly, in my opinion, that the laws of quantum gravity, which we don't yet know, but he was speculating that the
Speculating.
laws
Yeah.
of quantum gravity would explain why there is a universe rather than no universe. But actually, the answer to him, a decisive answer to him, was given by a great physicist who is every bit as smart as Stephen Hawking, and that is Stephen Hawking. Back in I think it was 88, a younger version of Stephen Hawking wrote a book that was very popular called A Brief History of Time. And in there,
Oh
he
yeah.
said, quite perceptively, profoundly actually, he said, all, and this is almost an exact quote, he said, all that any theory of physics any theory of physics is simply a set of mathematical rules and equations and cannot, and that was the word he used, cannot explain why there is a universe for those equations to describe.
Hmm.
And he was right about that. So I'll give you a simple analogy that explains why what he was saying. The rules, the laws of physics are a set of rules that govern the universe, how the universe unfolds, and they're analogous to the laws of a game.
Right.
The rules of chess are like the laws that govern how a chess game unfolds. Or the
Hmm.
laws of baseball, the rules of baseball govern how baseball games unfold. And so I could have in my hand a book that contained, let's baseball or chess, I don't care which, let's say baseball. I could have in my hand a book with all the laws of baseball.
Hmm.
That those laws tell you how a baseball game would begin, how it ends, the kinds of things that happen in it, how one thing in a baseball game causes another thing to happen, and so forth and so on.
Sure.
But what they don't tell you is whether there's an actual baseball game being played, or ever
Hmm.
has been played, or ever will be played. Just having the rules there, the rules themselves do not tell you anything about whether there ever has been or ever will be a
That's a
real
good point.
baseball game governed by those rules. And in the
Yeah.
same way, and they don't have the power. The mere rules of the game don't have a power to cause there to be an actual game. And in the same
Yeah.
way, the laws of physics are simply rules governing how a universe of a certain type, you know,
Hmm.
you can have different laws of physics and they would describe a different type of universe, but the rules don't have the power to make there be an
Hmm.
actually existing universe that the rules are, or that the equations are describing.
They don't have any agency in and of themselves.
Yeah,
They
they don't have
just
a
right.
power to make a universe.
Right.
Now I don't want to get into the technicalities of quantum gravity and why Hawking later got mixed up about this,
Sure.
but his earlier self actually gave the decisive refutation of what he started saying later in his life.
Hmm.
And so you can either say there's no reason why there's a universe, so that's the atheist answer; it just
Sure.
exists, or you can say that there's a cause of being, but to say that it's the laws of, which is the religious answer, the theistic answer, or you can
Hmm.
say, but to say that the laws of physics explain it is simply nonsensical, actually.
Sure.
And so, but anyway, so that's a bit of a digression, but this is a common issue for some people. They've heard these statements about quantum gravity creating universes and so on and so forth.
Sure. Well, and I think,
Um,
there's a lot a lot of us that, whether we like it or not, we just are so affected by the popular culture and whatever people who are watching this, listening to this, or you or me, whatever our personal opinion is of these Ant-Man movies, for example, the last few years. There was a funny line, I think it was in the second one when, the two physicists are talking off to the side and the word quantum keeps coming up, and Scott Lang, played by Paul Rudd, who I think he's that everyman, right? Like he's for most of us in the audience who aren't really familiar with this, and he just throws in there something like, "Do you guys just throw the word quantum in there?" Like whenever it was just a funny commentary on I. But in all seriousness, I think there's a lot of folks who they know about these things, or their awareness of, or in mine too, a lot of times the vocabulary isn't probably for most people coming from a really astute, purposeful, focused
no,
study of what
of
that
course, of
means, and
course, of course. So,
you know,
quantum mechanics does have profound philosophical implications, but there's a
mm,
great deal of disagreement about what they are. I mean, so people have
sure,
been debating for now about 100 years what are the implications, and there's very big differences among philosophers and among physicists of what quantum mechanics actually is telling us about reality. I actually think. Actually, here's see one of I wrote a book 20 years ago called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith,
mm,
and one of the main thesis of my book is that many of the big discoveries of the 20th century, far from undermining Christian belief, actually bring our view of the world closer to the Christian view than science had been before the 20th century.
sure. I was going to ask you about some of those. I don't
Yeah, and
want to
so
get into
actually,
yeah,
I think the profound philosophical implications of quantum mechanics are not are not subversive of religion, but quite the reverse. I'll give you two examples. So quantum mechanics is one of the things I talk about at length in my book. One of the big challenges to traditional religion before the 20th century, actually, it was one of the major body blows that Christian belief took at the hands of science,
mm,
was that science, until the early 20th century, seemed to say that the laws of physics are so rigid, the equations of physics are so rigidly that they rigidly control the way the world unfolds, so that from any given starting point, things have to unfold in a unique way
Mm,
because of the laws of physics. So we then can have no freedom of action. I cannot
right.
decide whether to do this or to do that because the laws, the equations will uniquely determine everything that goes
Deterministic,
on.
right.
Right. And
Mm,
that's called physical determinism. And so
hmm.
many people lost their belief in free will, human free will, and also in God because of this. Um, it turned out that turned out in the quantum mechanics, which came along in the mid 1920s, showed that the laws of physics aren't like that, and it shocked everybody. It turned out the laws of physics do not rigidly determine how the world will unfold. They only determine relative probabilities of various things happening, and
Mm,
that actually destroyed one of the very powerful argument that people had used against certain basic Christian beliefs. But the second thing that quantum mechanics seems, according to many very smart people, is again this is very controversial, what I'm about to say, but there's a number of great physicists who have taken this view. The quantum mechanics implies that not everything is physical. And in particular,
mm,
quantum mechanics, and people probably had heard this, quantum mechanics talks about physical systems, but also talks about observers. And the
right.
physical systems are the things that are described by the equations and things what are measured. So you
Mm,
measure systems, you calculate what systems are going to do with the equations. But the people making the measurements are called observers. And there's a strong argument, it goes back to the 1930s, that the equations cannot describe everything, including the observers, and we're
right.
observers. Of course, a lot about us, our bodies, is described by the equations, but the argument is if you try to describe an observer, which would include us, totally describe us using the equations of physics, you run into problems. So there's something about
Mm,
us or any observer that transcends entirely physical description. And so that again, up until then, physics seemed very materialistic. Everything's matter.
right.
That's all physics could talk about was matter and the equations that govern matter. That's all the physics was. Suddenly, with quantum mechanics, you don't just have material systems anymore
Mm,
described by equations, but you have these observers who can't arguably be described entirely by the equations. And so suddenly you don't have the whole framework is not really materialistic anymore. And it
mm,
leaves, so it's much more congenial to a traditional view of the world
sure.
in which you have matter, but also mind
Right.
as
Was
two
that,
fundamental.
again, I'm not totally read up by any means. Was that Heisenberg? Is that right? The
Well,
or
Heisenberg
part of that
certainly he was
with
of this
uncertainty?
view. He was of
Okay.
this view, and there are quotes I've written things on it where he says, um, where he talks about the importance of the know of observers and their knowledge.
Mm, hmm.
Um, but it really the argument itself goes back to John von Neumann, who is one of the great physicists and mathematician of the 20th century, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century.
Mm,
But a number of great physicists have pressed this argument too.
sure.
But anyway, so there's a lot
Yeah.
that's very esoteric.
Right.
But there are many examples of where major discoveries I'd say there are a number of big examples of where big discoveries of the 20th century have brought our view of things closer to the
Sure.
traditional religious view. The Big
Or just
Bang
like
is another
or
example.
reinforcing, would that be a good word to use
I
too?
would
Are they
say
reinforce
reinforces it seem
or
to
support a
align
line?
better. I mean,
Hmm.
another example is the Big Bang, and I
Yeah.
don't want to say the Big Bang proves creation because that's a whole, I don't I think
Right.
those are
That
two
gets
separate things. But I will say that until the Big Bang theory came along in the 1930s, late 20s, 1920s, the scientific evidence seemed to point to the universe having existed for infinite time, having had no
Right.
beginning. And that also seemed not to
Which
fit
would be
very well with
problematic.
be
Right.
problematic because we all believe, based on the first words of the Bible, in the beginning.
Mm,
So our faith teaches us that there is a beginning, a temporal beginning,
right.
some finite time ago, and so then and a lot of people felt that that was a superstitious or religious, that was sort of religious, primitive religious mythology
Mm,
to say that the universe had a beginning. The scientific view was that the universe had existed for all time. But lo and behold, along came the Big Bang Theory, and which is now, which seems to show very strongly points to there having actually been a beginning of
right.
this universe. And so that again is a place where the picture, if anything, so people should understand that the scientific developments, they think they all the big breakthroughs somehow lead us farther from a religious picture of the world. What I'm saying is that actually, in a number of, I'd say most cases, if not all, they brought us, the big breakthroughs have brought us our picture of the
Sure.
world closer to the traditional one,
Sure.
traditional religious one.
Is there any other one in particular that well, I'm sure there's plenty, but
I would say
some
another one I talk about in my book, and people may have heard of this, is the anthropic coincidences. So
mm,
it was for a long time, people would say that the world, that we're an accident in the cosmic scheme. We're
right.
just this fluke. Bertrand Russell said that we are a curious accident in a backwater of the universe. Steven Weinberg, a great physicist who died couple of years ago, a year or two ago, wrote a popular book in 1970s in which he said, the more we learn about the universe, the more pointless it seems. And so that here we are in this vast universe that doesn't care about us. We don't amount to a hill of beans. We're just this little chemical
Right.
accident on this tiny planet, which is lost in the vastness of
Yep.
space.
Waiting to be stamped out at any minute
Right. And
or
so,
something.
how can we be important when
Right.
we're so tiny compared to the universe? If we're important, why did God create all that vast stretches of empty space?
Hmm.
And we only inhabit this little teensy weensy, practically a point in the universe. How can that, doesn't that show how insignificant we are?
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, and Weinberg sort of scoffed at it, didn't scoff at it. He said, it's tempting for us to believe that we were somehow built in from the beginning, he said. But the more we've learned, the more we see that we worked, that we're just, an accident. Well, actually, in the last 30 or 40 years, it's now become, there's been many examples have been found of where the laws of physics seem to be just right. The
Mm,
structure of the laws of physics seem to be just right to make it possible for the universe to give rise to living things. And these are
sure.
called sometimes anthropic coincidences.
Right.
And it used to be that this idea was almost taboo to talk about in the scientific community. It sounded too much like religion.
Yeah.
As one famous Nobel Prize winner in physics said, he didn't like the whole idea to even talk about it because it smells like religion, he said.
Mm,
Well, now it's accepted
mm,
as a fact by most physicists. So Stephen Weinberg, for example, no, Stephen Hawking, in his last book, said that the laws of physics seem to be, quote, tailor-made
mm,
to make it possible for there to be beings such as ourselves. And that if they were even slightly altered, we wouldn't be here.
mm.
And so
That's
Hawking
the
has said
fine
this.
tuning.
Yeah. So
I
this
think I've
is
heard it's called.
now
Yeah.
accepted that at least on the face of things, if you were to monkey around with the laws of physics and even make some small changes to them, it would have such radical consequences that it probably the universe with these altered laws would not allow life to exist. So the people sometimes say the universe is fine tuned with the laws of physics. That's our dog. Don't worry about the
Oh no,
phantom.
no. They're
An
always
excited
welcome.
dog has just run into the room.
Mine
He,
runs in most of the
he's
time too.
excited by the fact that the laws of physics are just exactly
Right.
fine tuned to make his existence possible. So there's another example where, for a long time, science, a lot of people saw science is pointing to our insignificance. And
Mm.
now, actually, if anything, if you take things at face value, what we know about the laws of physics seems very much it seems very much like we were built in from the beginning. And
Mm.
a very good example of this is the size of the universe, which a lot of people have felt points to our insignificance, but there's actually the way the laws of physics are set up. If the universe weren't as vast as it is, we couldn't be here.
Really?
And the reason is it takes billions of years for us to arrive on the scene. It takes billions
Sure,
of
sure.
years first to produce the elements of the periodic table. It took
Right.
billions of years of astrophysical processes to give rise to all the chemical elements that we're
Mm-hmm.
made of. But then it takes billions of years of biological evolution to produce
Right.
beings like
Sort of
us, or like
anatomically or a modern human,
right,
right.
or
Oh,
like
excuse me.
Gipper, the dog who just was here a minute ago. It takes billions of years to produce us or Gipper. Now, but the universe, according to Einstein's theory of gravity, unless the universe is as big as it is, it won't last billions of years. So
Mm.
if you want a universe that doesn't get bigger than a few thousand miles across, for example, say that, why didn't God make the universe just a few thousand miles across? Because it would only have lasted a few hundredths of a second, not the
Mm.
billions of years you need for life. So the vastness of the universe points to us in a way. It's a
Wow.
precondition. It's a precondition for our being.
Sure.
So
That's incredible.
there are other examples as well, but I probably given more than enough.
Well, no, and that's that, and I hate to put a pin in it, but we can kind of bring it home here for
Okay.
now, and maybe have a future installment too to go deeper. But I just maybe just in closing, and I can't thank you again enough for sharing your time with us here. Is there anything, suggestions you have for anyone? I mean, like I said, I have the links
Yes.
here. We didn't talk about the website much, but I'm just looking at it here too for the Society of Catholic Scientists, and it just seems like such a
Yes.
great resource and a place for people to network and
I'm so grateful that you brought that up because I would have
yeah,
forgotten. Um, our website has a lot of educational resources on it. So, for example, if you go, you have the links, but if you
Mhm.
forget the links, just Google Catholic scientists and it'll come up at some point.
That's what I did.
And Society of Catholic Scientists. Now, we have a thing on the front page. If you look for common questions, that's
Mm.
common questions about science and faith. And those we have at the moment, 16 commonly asked questions. In fact, we got these from high school religion teachers that tell us or high school teachers who told us these are the most common questions they get about science and faith from their
Sure.
students. And we have very meaty but quite accessible answers to these. Each question has about a 700, 800
Yeah.
word answer, which we think are very solid and clear answers to these 16 questions.
And with some
Um,
great references and
with great
footnotes and
references to them.
yep.
And I think I would say every parent who has a child who's interested in science or any even if their child's not, this is a go-to place
Mm.
to get answers to these very basic questions. We also have bios, short readable bios of about 100 great scientists. Almost all of them are great scientists. These are people who left their mark on scientific history. Things are named after them, equations and so on are named after who are practicing believing Catholics, and it's like a who's who of
Yeah.
science of the last 400 years. They're just it's just an incredible roster of great names in the history of science who are believing and practicing Catholic, and there are little bios of them. And then we have articles, some of which we think all of them are very good. So at the moment, we have over 30 articles on the website on aspects of science and faith questions that I think people would benefit from. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of stuff up there. And so this is what we need. We have the
Yeah.
arguments and facts. As I said, people need simply to reach out and learn this material, or
Sure.
the arguments are on our side. The facts are on our side.
Yeah.
It's just a question of people learning these things, and because you're not going to
Absolutely.
necessarily learn it, um, you're not necessarily going to learn it from the atheists.
Well, and maybe, hopefully, God willing, along the way, some of them, well, and, we have cases. I've heard many testimonies. I'm sure you've heard many yourself of folks who have, through that scientific inquiry, maybe seen something that opened
Well,
their
yes, I
eyes
mean,
to this deeper
I just
level.
came
So
across an interview where they're great science. He's a person, I won't use his name, but
Mm.
he's considered by physicists they've taken surveys, and physicists will vote him as the smartest physicist in the world.
Mm.
I'll tell you his name. His name was Ed Witten. Now, he's not religious. In
Mm.
fact, he's a skeptic. He says he's a skeptical agnostic. But he was being interviewed recently on YouTube,
Mm.
and he said the laws of physics are so sophisticated mathematically, and they're based on such subtle and deep mathematical ideas that he said, and this is a quote: "It's as if the universe had been created by a mathematician," he said. Okay. So this isn't coming out of the mouth of a Catholic. This is coming out of the
Mm.
mouth of an unbeliever. But he said the way the laws of physics look,
Yeah.
they look like they were created by a mathematician. Okay, so
You have to wonder. I mean, that's Christ the Logos, who holds everything in being. Like
right,
nothing's a mistake, right? I mean, he knows how to reach everybody, but whether
yeah, the
whether
world
whether
was
we
not.
reach back, right? That's the question.
The world was put together by somebody who was very smart.
Needless to say. Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited for people to get these get started with these resources, and especially anyone in education too. I'm going to make an appeal. So, well,
Good.
thank you so much, and God bless you. I appreciate it.
Okay, I was happy to be on. Thank you very much.
That was a lot of fun, I got to tell you. And I didn't want to end. We were operating off the Zoom recording this time around. I use different platforms sometimes and ran out of time and had to restart so we could keep going. And I was delighted to do it. But I just want to end here briefly with just a couple things he and I had talked about. The Stratford Caldecott book I mentioned, I also have linked below. This Beauty for Truth's Sake. This is the version I have here. The Reenchantment of Education. And this is, among other things, something that Stratford Caldecott had mentioned, that specifically with this balance of faith and reason and this harmony. And I just want to share this at length, and then I'll go ahead and close us out here. He says, freedom and knowledge go together. In order to be free, we must know. But religious believers know things both by reason and by faith. These two remain distinct, and it is not a choice between one and the other, as it would be if faith were, as critics allege, simply believing something without evidence and clinging to it no matter what. Their relationship is one of reciprocal illumination. That's a beautiful image, right? That faith enlightens reason in a way that reason on its own can't do. And likewise, reason enlightens faith. They are meant to work together. Faith needs reason to illuminate and unfold its own content. Reason needs faith to teach it things it cannot know by its own powers, as well as things it may have forgotten. In 1998, in Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul II famously likens faith and reason to the two wings on which we rise to the contemplation of the truth. So Fides et Ratio, from a Catholic perspective, is an absolute must Catholic encyclical on these ideas. I also have that linked below as well for you. And then just last little thing here. I'm not going to go into all of it. He goes a lot more in depth, but this just to whet your beak a little bit. In speaking of reason, however, as Pope Benedict XVI said in his Regensburg lecture of 2006, we must, quote, overcome the self-imposed limitation of reason to the empirically verifiable. Caldecott continues, we are helped in overcoming this limitation by a distinction many ancient authors made between discursive and contemplative intelligence, or between a lower and a higher kind of reason. Reason at the level of soul, ratio, and reason at the level of spirit, intellectus. And then he goes on to quote from German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper, who talked about this idea. And it's a beautiful thing. I want to recommend you look the book up. It's a short book, but this took me weeks because it's so profound. You keep stopping and like look at all my tabs here, right? And there's this idea that our ratio, that there's an element to our reason that is calculating and problem solving and very much, measured and analytical. But that's not the only aspect of our reason. That there is a quiet, contemplative, receptive aspect of our reason, this intellectus, by which we, using our reason, pay attention to the world around us in love and receive it as it is, being given to us at that moment by God, who is right now making it, right? Catholics don't believe, for example, that God created the universe or created everything billions of years ago and then he just, well, there you go. He's present now, always. Christ the Logos makes all things to be now. He holds all being together now. God is absolutely transcendent and absolutely immanent everywhere all the time. And that is exciting because for the person of faith and reason, you can operate and move forward at every moment with that anticipation of at any moment encountering the living God. That's exciting. That's much fuller and freer. And I encourage all of you, especially any of you who are teachers, please, please take Dr. Barr up on what he was saying there. We got to share this. We have to share these links. We have to talk to our students this way. We have to all ourselves awaken to this and to get past this ridiculous, non-existent somehow breakdown that is proposed out there between faith and reason, the supposed disconnect. Let's get past this. Let's speak the truth in love. We can do it together, and we should. It's our responsibility. So God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave us some comments below. Give us some feedback on this episode and share it far and wide, okay? So God bless you guys, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.